So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karina. I'm part of the research group on theory of human rights, the NTDH, and today I'll be moderating this event with Ana Karamuru, who is also part of the NTDH. So, welcome to the first international roundtable on applied phenomenology. First of all, I would like to thank you for your presence in the audience, especially our professors who will compose this roundtable. Just a quick reminder before we start, for those of you who are interested in the certificate of attendance, we will soon share a link in the chat so you can access and guarantee your certificate. Now I will give the floor to Ana, who will introduce our lecture.
Thank you, Karina, and thanks everyone who's here with us today. Thank you, Professor Simon Dickel, for being here with us. Thank you, Professor Vitor Fônseca, Professor Philippe de Almeida, Professor Ana Paula Barbosa-Fohrmann. We'll introduce the debaters a little bit later, but right now I would like to introduce and welcome Dr. Simon Dickel, who is a professor of gender and diversity studies at the Folkwang University of the Arts, and among many other things, he's author of books such as Black Gay, the Harlem Renaissance, the Protest Era and Constructions of Black Gay Identity in the 1980s and 90s, co-author of the book After the Storm, The Cultural Politics of Hurricane Karina, and his recent and very interesting book called Embodying Difference, Critical Phenomenology and Narratives of Disability, Race, and Sexuality, in which this is the book I have recently read that I was mentioning to him a little while back. He analyzes narratives in the fields of disability studies, critical race theory, and queer studies from a critical phenomenological standpoint. So today, Professor Dickel will be speaking about critical phenomenology and disability in a lecture entitled Critical Phenomenology in Disability Studies. So, Professor, the floor is yours. You have 40 minutes, and after that, we'll introduce and invite the debaters to participate as well. I'm going to add you here to the transmission. Hi.
Hi. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and of course also for inviting me to this roundtable. I'm very happy to be here and to discuss things with you later on. Should I just start?
Yes, so you can start.
Okay. So since the founding of the Journal of Critical Phenomenology in 2018 and the publication of the handbook, 50 Concepts for Critical Phenomenology 2 years later, the term critical phenomenology has been widely used to theoretically and systematically grasp the connection between embodiment, experiences of difference, and social power relations. Critical phenomenology builds on approaches from disability studies, gender and queer studies, and critical race theory, among others, to address the bodily dimensions of stigmatization, the consequences of visibility or invisibility of difference, and the meaning of bodily habits, especially habits of seeing. And they do this from a phenomenological perspective. Another central theoretical point of reference is Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his book Phenomenology of Perception, first published in 1945. Within disability studies, phenomenological approaches were received earlier and more strongly than in other disciplines in order to extend post-structuralist theories and problematize the division into a medical and a social model of disability. I'll go into that in more detail later on. A critical phenomenological approach does not see these models in contradiction, but asks about how language, knowledge formations, and discourses relate to the lived experiences and bodily being in the world of concrete subjects. Not only the theoretical concepts of disability studies, but also many autobiographical texts of authors with disabilities present ideas that can be translated into terms of phenomenology. In my talk, I will highlight references between memoirs by Kenny Freese, Eli Clare, Robert F. Murphy, Simi Linton, Stephen Kusisto, and Rod Michalko, and some elements of phenomenology and critical phenomenology, and argue that these texts should also be read as seminal contributions to phenomenological debates. According to G. Thomas Kauser in his 2009 somewhat schematic typology of autobiographies of disabled writers, the book is called Signifying Bodies, Disability in Contemporary Life Writing. The text that I'm addressing today can be described as new disability memoirs. They signal a disability political consciousness, a focus on disability rather than impairment, and they are not aimed primarily at formal innovation or linguistic experimentation. And I will always put the books that I'm talking about next to me that you can see which text I'm addressing. So in the chapter The Beehive of his memoir, The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory from 2007, the writer and disability activist Kenny Freese tells how he climbs the top of the mountain The Beehive in Acadia National Park on the island of Mount Desert in Maine, together with his non-disabled life partner Ian. In the first line, Freese describes himself as, quote, a 5-foot-tall man with fibulae in both legs, end of quote, and asks, without fibulae in both legs, and asks the question that other hikers may be asking, namely, what he is doing at the top of this mountain. This question refers to the assumption that a person with a physical impairment cannot fully participate in outdoor sports such as hiking or climbing. The Beehive disproves this assumption, however, because this time it is Ian who usually supports his partner while hiking, who has difficulty in reaching the top of the mountain. As soon as the nature of the path changes and the two have to use different metal rungs in the rocks while climbing the summit, the expected relationship between body and world changes for them. And I quote, I watch Ian ascend handhold to handhold. He slips a bit when he is unable to fit his size 13 feet where they need to be to keep his 6-foot, 1-inch body steady during the climb. Just as I thought, my feet fit easily into the handholds and I make it up this ladder more easily than the first two. The narrative makes clear that successfully reaching the summit is not grounded in the specific bodies of Freese or Ian, nor does it depend solely on the nature of the route. Rather, the success of the hike depends on how body and world relate to each other. And this is presented in the text as a dynamic rather than as a static condition. In the quotation you heard earlier, the verb to fit is used twice, and just before reaching the summit, Freese again states, quote, my right foot fits perfectly in the top rung, end of quote. This use of to fit has some parallels to Rosemary Garland Thompson's disability studies concept misfit, which she developed a few years later. In her 2011 essay, Misfits, a feminist materialist disability concept, she introduces the concept to circumvent the limitations of the medical and the social models within disability studies that locate disability either exclusively in the body, as is the case with the medical model, or in the built environment and ableist norms. This is the social model. Misfit is a concept that adheres to the emancipatory approach of the social construction of disability, while having an awareness that pain and functional limitations manifest on a bodily level. So in a way, it combines medical and social model. The advantage of the concept of misfit is that it does not locate the deficits in individuals' bodies, but rather draws attention to how particular bodies relate to the world. In the Beehive, Freese initially assumes that Ian's body fits the requirements of the trail because the route was conceptualized, designed, and built in anticipation of bodies considered in the dominant perspective as uniform, standard majority bodies. And this is the way that Garland Thompson formulates it. However, because of Ian's height and the way Freese's shoes fit into the handholds, the anticipated relationship between fit and misfit is reversed. The beehive particularly highlights the instability of the category of disability that also informs the concept of misfit. As Fries again explicitly states, quote, "I could not have survived the beehive today if my shoes were any different than they are. Because of the shape of my shoes, I was able to transform metal rungs stuck in the side of a cliff into footholds." And in the end of the chapter, he takes this experience to reflect on the dynamic aspects of being in the world. Quote, "I look at the shape of my feet, my left heel wandering to the side, my right foot jutting out at almost a right angle. So different than the way they looked 10 years ago. When did the change occur? How soon before I'm walking on the edges of both feet? How much longer will shoes enable me to walk? How many earthquakes did it take to change the world's surface? The granite of the Andes, seemingly so stable as the Mount Desert Island granite that enabled me to climb the beehive, had once been as fluid as the blue water, or is it sky, or Frenchman's Bay?" End of quote. The quotation makes clear that the relationship between body and world is not static. The different ways of looking at the body are reflected in the juxtaposition of static granite and liquid water, a contrast that is only seemingly permanent. The quotation also blurs the distinction between water and sky, pointing to how a dynamic understanding of bodies expands our notions of their limits. In 2020, Garland Thompson's concept of misfit was included in the volume 50 Concepts for a Critical Phenomenology. This handbook follows the alphabet and claims to map the emerging field of critical phenomenology. This field is an interdisciplinary field that combines concepts from a variety of disciplines, including philosophy, disability studies, critical race theory, and gender and queer studies. These concepts have in common that they take a power-critical perspective on the construction of categories of difference, and at the same time emphasizing the importance of bodily experiential knowledge, building, among others, on Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. In this book, he argues that as human beings, we are bodily oriented in time and space, and that our ability to perceive and understand the world depends on bodily orientation and movement. Merleau-Ponty's approach that cognition is a bodily process is at odds with prevailing Western beliefs based on René Descartes' notion of a separation between mind and body, evident in the phrase cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology thus conceptualizes the relationship between mind and body in contrast to Cartesian dualism. At first glance, the recourse of critical phenomenology to Merleau-Ponty's thought is surprising, for he is often criticized for implicitly assuming a universal subject that is assumed to be cis-male, white, heterosexual, and non-disabled. In her essay, The Normal, the Natural, and the Normative, a Merleau-Pontian legacy to feminist theory, critical race theory, and disability studies, philosopher Gail Weiss accepts this critique, but also emphasizes the place of difference in Merleau-Ponty's thought. And I quote Weiss, "Merleau-Ponty spent so much time in phenomenology of perception discussing allegedly abnormal experiences, not as negative examples that reinforce the rigid boundaries of normality, but, I would argue, to challenge our conceptions of what is normal, what is natural, and what can and should be normative." End of quote. Weiss explicitly gives 3 examples to which Merleau-Ponty refers: the phantom limb, aphasia, and brain injury, and states that these are precisely not examples of limitations, but that Merleau-Ponty is always concerned with their enabling aspects. The first chapter, The Mountain, of Eli Clare's memoir Exile and Pride, first published in 1999, also tells of climbing a mountain. Clare, a queer man with cerebral palsy, wants to climb Mount Adams in New Hampshire with his non-disabled girlfriend, Adrian. The mountain and the summit are used here as metaphors for normative ideology that negatively affects marginalized people. The mountain symbolizes the ideology of upward mobility to which all who do not meet expectations of class, disability, sexuality, or national affiliation are subjected. Claire's decision to abandon the climb of the mountain and to return before reaching the summit represents a break with dominant ideologies. In addition to confronting ableist structures in an attempt to conform to societal norms, Claire notes, quote, "We come face to face with our own bodies, all that we cherish and despise, all that lies embedded there." End of quote. Claire thus addresses two dimensions with which critical phenomenology is concerned: oppressive social norms and the ways in which such norms are embodied. He reflects on the medical and social models of disability, noting that while the theoretical division into these two models may have political advantages, it leaves no room to address, quote, important emotional realities, end of quote. Both impairment and disability, according to Claire, focus on one's body. This means that disability cannot be conceptualized as a social construction without asking how normative discourses affect the body and the life. As early as 1997, Bill Hughes and Kevin Patterson based their theoretical approach on Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology in order to overcome the opposition between the medical model and the social model of disability. In their essay, The Social Model of Disability and the Disappearing Body Towards the Sociology of Impairment, they critique the strict separation of the two models. In arguing for a sociology of impairment as a prerequisite for a social theory of disability, and the notion that impairment also has a social dimension, they combine two theoretical discourses that are often seen as incompatible, namely post-structuralism and phenomenology. According to Hughes and Patterson, both discourses theorize the body in more complex ways than the division between the medical and the social model suggests. Building on the work of Michel Foucault, they complicate the distinction between impairment, the term which is used in the medical model, and disability, the term used in the social model, by viewing somatic sensations as discursively constructed. They emphasize the connection between body, language, and power, explaining that the embodiment of disability depends on the way impaired bodies are discursively constructed. This post-structuralist view of the body, they argue, contrasts with the view of advocates of the medical model who treat impairments as givens and posit a body without a history. However, they also criticized post-structuralism's tendency to neglect the material dimensions of the body. In their view, a strict distinction between impairment and disability gets in the way of theorizing lived experience. To address the lived experience of people with disabilities, Hughes and Patterson turn to phenomenology. And this is a longer quote from their essay. The impaired body is a lived body. Disabled people experience impairment as well as disability, not in separate Cartesian compartments, but as part of a complex interpenetration of oppression and affliction. The body is the stuff of human affliction and affectivity, as well as the subject-object of oppression. The value of a phenomenological sociology of the body to the development of a sociology of impairment is that it embodies the addition of sentience and sensibility to notions of oppression and exclusion. Disability is experienced in, on, and through the body, just as impairment is experienced in terms of the personal and cultural narratives that help to constitute its meaning. Impairment and disability meet in the body not as the dualistic clash of inner and outer phenomena, but insofar as impairment structures perceptions about disability and disablement is part of the felt world. End of quote. Their conceptualization of impairment and disability challenges the mutual independence of a biological sphere from a cultural sphere. Even more, their argument for the interdependencies of lived bodies and cultural narratives runs counter to the distinction between medical and social models. In line with Hughes and Patterson's intervention, Clare in Exile and Pride considers, quote, the body as home, but only if it is understood that language also lives under the skin, end of quote. He refers to the negative and hurtful names he had been called: crip, queer, freak, redneck. They refer to disability, sexuality, gender, and class. The terms can hurt, but they can also be empowering when used as terms for emancipation. Quote, none of these are easy words. They mark the jagged edge between self-hatred and pride, the chasm between how the dominant culture views marginalized peoples and how we view ourselves, the razor between finding home, finding our bodies, and living in exile, living on the metaphoric mountain, end of quote. Clare's quotation underscores that embodiment cannot be conceptualized without addressing the role of language and the way our social world is constructed through power and discourse. Clare expands the scope of language to emphasize the cultural influence of place of origin in one's being in the world. He sees, quote, the body as home, but only if one understands that place, community, and culture are deeply rooted in our bones, end of quote. This idea is also central to critical phenomenology. The social norms of a place and culture affect how a person can feel at home in their body and what habits they can form. Despite their different ends, the two autobiographical texts by Clare and Fries show that embodiment cannot be thought of or discussed independently from language, power, and the material conditions that determine the lives of those who are oppressed. Merleau-Ponty's concept of the body schema describes how the different parts of the body are experienced as a unity. When people perform a movement, different parts of the body come into play without any prior rational decisions to perform the movement. Everyday movements, such as reaching for a cup of coffee, happen automatically. In the autobiographies, The Body Silent, and in the one I'll speak about later, My Body Politic, Robert F. Murphy and Simi Linton describe the different effects their paralyses have on their physical being in the world and on their body schema. In The Body Silent, which was published in 1990, Murphy describes the effects of progressive quadriplegia caused by a tumor in the spinal cord. As an anthropologist, he formulates the claim to write, quote, a social history of paralytic illnesses, end of quote. And here may be the reason for the detached attitude and sometimes a little harsh language compared to other disability memoirs. Especially in chapter 4, The Damaged Self, Murphy refers to the unity of body and mind as a central component of phenomenology and builds on Merleau-Ponty to describe the experience of his progressive impairment as one of disembodiment. He conceptualizes disability as a deficiency, a disruption of the body schema, stating, quote, the amputee is missing more than a limb. He is also missing one of his conceptual links to the world, an anchor of his very existence, end of quote. At this point, Murphy's characterization of amputations corresponds with David Morris's assessment of the fundamental impact that chronic illness has on a human's being in the world. Quote, specifically, illness reveals itself not simply as an absence of the proper function of an objective body or its parts, but as a vividly experienced change in one's access to the world. This is especially the case in drastic or chronic illness. Such an illness changes what one can hope for, project, and do in one's world, and correlatively changes the sense of oneself, even one's consciousness, end of quote. Morris notes that a change in bodily capabilities can have an impact on the mind and on subjectivity. Quote, one's existential projects are not pure projections of subjectivity, for they can be modulated by changes rising from the organic level, for example, by a prosthesis that gives a new way of moving, end of quote. Whereas Linton, in her autobiography, My Body Politic, describes how the body schema emerges anew through the use of assistive devices, in her case, the use of a wheelchair, and a new way of moving is made possible, Murphy refers to the effects of his impairment as a continued disembodiment, and for this very reason, he emphasizes that his approach to the world is a bodily one. He attributes movement as central to his being in the world. Quote, the quadriplegic's body can no longer speak a silent language in the expression of emotions or concepts too elusive for ordinary speech. For the delicate feedback loops between thought and movement have been broken. Proximity, gesture, and body set have been muted, and the body's ability to articulate thought has been stilled. It is perhaps for this reason that writing has become almost an addiction for me, for in it, thought and mind become a system united in conjunction with the movement of my hands and the responses of the machine. Of even more profound impact on existential states, the thinking activity of the brain cannot be dissolved into motion, and the mind can no longer be lost in an internal dialogue with physical movement. This leaves one adrift in a lonely monologue, an inner soliloquy without rest or surcease, and often without subject matter. Consciousness is overtaken and devoured in contemplation, meditation, ratiocination, and reflection without end, relieved only by one's remaining movements and sleep. End of quote. Murphy explains that writing is meaningful to him because it remains the only activity in which he can connect mind, thought, and body. For this reason, he characterizes his overall situation with reference to Merleau-Ponty. Quote, my thoughts and sense of being alive have been driven back into my brain where I now reside. More than ever before, it is the base from which I reach out and grasp the world. Many paralytics say that they no longer feel attached to their bodies, which is another way of expressing the shattering of Merleau-Ponty's mind-body system. End of quote. In contrast, Simi Linton describes how her body schema is restored after being paralyzed in a car accident. Linton must first look to understand where her legs are. She describes the process by which she regains a sense of the position of her legs as a re-embodiment that leads to the restoration of her body schema with a sense of the position of her legs. Quote, while initially I had to find my legs with my eyes, I can now reach down with my arm, hook it under my knees, and reposition my legs with as little conscious thought as it takes to reach out my hand and pick up a pencil on my desk. End of quote. Toward the end of the autobiography, she explains that her arm movements when steering the wheelchair are as automatic as walking was for her before the accident. These have become physical habits that she performs without thinking. In addition to these passages in which Linton explicitly names the process of embodiment, the motif of dance throughout clarifies the connection between movement and embodiment, as she repeatedly describes in the autobiography that dancing in her wheelchair is central to her bodily experience. In Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty uses the example of a blind person learning to use a white cane to explain the concept of habit, and to show how instruments are incorporated. According to Merleau-Ponty, perceiving the world through a white cane becomes a habit that helps the blind person navigate the world. Through repeated use of the cane, the person integrates it into their body schema. In her essay, Why Should Our Bodies End at the Skin? Embodiment, Boundaries, and Soma Techniques, philosopher Margaret Childrick refers positively to Merleau-Ponty's example. Quote, Merleau-Ponty does demonstrate the transformational nature of prosthesis, famously in the example of the blind man's cane becoming an extension of his self-embodiment, and shows that the lived body is not identical with the material entity bounded by the skin. End of quote. Philosopher Joel Michael Reynolds, on the other hand, criticizes Merleau-Ponty's example, arguing that it ignores the social dimensions at work in the use of a white cane, particularly the fact that the white cane visibly marks blindness and thus subjects the blind person to stigmatization. Quote, Merleau-Ponty's famous reading of the blind man's cane misconstrues the radicality of blindness as a world-creating disability and operates by an able-bodied simulation that conflates object annexation or extension with incorporation. End of quote. So Reynolds criticizes Merleau-Ponty for not adequately describing the lived experience of blindness. Instead, he says, the example refers to a situation in which a sighted person begins to use a white cane. As a result, he finds Merleau-Ponty's example unconvincing. He accepts it merely to support an argument for object extension and object annexation. Garland Thompson also addresses the use of the white cane in her explanation of the concept of misfit, which I talked about earlier. However, she is not concerned with whether it is integrated into the body schema. Quote, a white cane or a braille book is an element of the sustaining environment for a blind person to encounter a fit that accommodates the minority embodiment of blindness in an environment built for the sighted. Such prostheses ease the material divergences between bodies and their location, making misfits into fits. So similar with the situation of Ian and Kenny Freeze on the mountain, the white cane changes the way a blind person can move in the world and become a fit in her terminology. Garland Thompson describes how the white cane changes the relationship between body and world, and a misfit becomes a fit as a result. But here too, the question would have to be asked about how this relationship is again affected by the blindness that is now made visible. Earlier than Childrick, Reynolds, and Garland Thompson, the new disability memoirs by blind authors Stephen Cosisto and Rod Michalko made an important contribution to this philosophical discussion. They describe what the cane means to them, essentially confirming Reynolds' position formulated many years later. In Planet of the Blind, this book, Cosisto uses the white cane for the first time at the age of 39. Orientation and mobility specialist Mike Dillon, quote, shows him a long, folding white cane with a rubber handle like a golf club. There's a plastic tip on the far end for sensing the changes in the terrain. The whole thing glows in the dark and it is surprisingly light. When you don't need it, you can fold it up and put it away. End of quote. Cosisto's subsequent account of how he becomes accustomed to the cane focuses on the fact that he no longer passes for sighted. In this context, Dillon points to a direct positive effect of this visibility. Quote, when you use this cane, people get out of your way, cars slow down. Cosisto emphasizes the consequences of being perceived as blind. Quote, he hands it to me and I take it. Finally, nothing terrible happens. He shows me how to use it, sweeping from side to side like an electronic metal detector. The paradox is that my cane produces only casual regard. Cars slow for me. An old man on a porch calls out cheerfully. I am wrapped in the silence of discovery. I'm an acrobat walking on the wings of a biplane. I'm both light-headed and somber, bending to a delicate task. Nothing terrible happens. I can be disabled. on this ordinary street. I need to touch my hair. I want to feel my own face. Nothing is ever going to be precisely the same. My cane is a divining rod." End of quote. This quotation makes clear that the use of the white cane is significant for Cosisto because his blindness is now perceived by others. Quote, "Nothing happens, I can be disabled." His conscious use of the stigmatized identity categories of disabled and blind is inseparable from his use of the cane. In addition to the function as an aid, the cane has immediate consequences for his lived experience and being in the world, but this is a dimension that Merleau-Ponty does not address in his example. While the other examples Merleau-Ponty gives in Phenomenology of Perception to explain the extension of the body schema, namely wearing a hat with a feather and driving a car, do not involve stigmatization, using a white cane marks blindness. For this reason, the three examples Merleau-Ponty gives in his explanation of the terms motor habit and perceptual habit are on different levels, or at least have different implications. With his decision to use a white cane, Cosisto, who passed as sighted all his life, becomes blind for all to see, and he refers to this as his coming out. For Cosisto, the benefits of the cane have limits. It does help him to move faster, but he's aware of the limitations. Quote, "The cane feels good in my hand. My adjustment to it has been grudging, but altogether necessary. I recognize this. With Mike Dillon's encouragement, I do not cheat and take the cane with me every time I leave the house. I've been doing this for about a month. But I have to convince myself that the morning air is innocent, that fear is less florid than reality, that the world's red insects will not come flying at my face." End of quote. While trying to cross a street at an intersection where the traffic lights do not work, he and his companion are almost run over by a car. Because of this accident, Cosisto directly names the limitations of the cane. "I need something more powerful than the cane. I need eyes. Now that I'm out of the closet and blind for everyone to see, the cane has done all that it can do." End of quote. He explicitly limits the usefulness of the white cane to its coming out function without mentioning the positive aspects from Merleau-Ponty's example, namely the integration of the cane into the body schema. In his account of the use of the white cane in The Two in One, Walking with Smokey, Walking with Blindness, first published in 1999, Rod Michalko points out similar benefits and limitations. Instead of using the term stigma, he uses the term pathos and relates it to the white cane as a marker of blindness. Quote, "Considering the cane as a guide to mobility made me aware of the pathos of blindness. The cane was an unmistakable sign of labored and graceless movement. Its whiteness suggested naive vulnerability. The white cane represented sheer necessity without choice." In pointing out the limitations of the cane, Michalko makes direct reference to Merleau-Ponty's idea that the white cane is integrated into the body schema of blind people, but without explicitly referencing phenomenology of perception. Quote, "I found that my speed and confidence did not increase significantly, and the ever-present pathos filled me with an unease that I could not readily identify. Becoming a skilled user of the white cane was not particularly challenging, and I felt no sense of mastery. I did not experience the cane as an extension of my body or as part of myself. I soon discarded it and reverted to my original mode of travel, which was not as safe, but was at least free of pathos." End of quote. Due to ableism and the stigma associated with blindness, the cane marks Cosisto and Michalko as blind. Previously, both could pass as sighted. Now they are perceived as disabled and treated differently by those around them. In his poem, The Magic Wand, the black and blind poet and playwright Lynn Manning describes the same effect in powerful words. The poem depicts a situation in which the speaker, who is blind and black, unfolds his white cane. As a result, the racist stereotypes of white and sighted bystanders are replaced with ableist stereotypes of blindness. The change is described as, quote, a profound metamorphosis, end of quote, that, for example, replaces assumptions about the speaker's ability to play basketball with ideas about his musical talent, or swaps stereotypes of hypermasculinity with those of demasculinization. On the one hand, the poem draws attention to the fact that blindness and blackness are often considered mutually exclusive categories, and on the other hand, it reveals that both racist and ableist stereotypes are often gendered. Manning's poem therefore underscores the need for an intersectional analysis of categories of difference. In his autobiographical poem, the intersectional perspective builds on his experiences as a black and blind author, and thus differs from the other texts by white authors discussed here. In particularly, Murphy and Linton's texts feature race analogies in which disability and blackness are paralleled. Such race analogies render black disabled subject positions invisible and thus prevent an intersectional perspective. They are inattentive to the specificity of racism, and they also complicate political alliances, for example, between anti-racist and disability movements. In their autobiographical texts, Cosisto, Michalko, and Manning reflect at length on the impact that their decision to use the white cane has had on their lives, explicitly and implicitly contradicting the thesis, often repeated in philosophical texts, that blind persons integrate the white cane into their body schema. Instead, all three clearly highlight the stigmatizing effect of the white cane. In contrast to the matter-of-fact descriptions of the use of the white cane, Cosisto and Michalko impressively describe their experiences with their guide dogs as profound changes in their bodily being in the world, but there's no time to address this topic here. To conclude, the currently emerging field of critical phenomenology considers how culture affects the body in multiple and different sensitive ways. From this perspective, social constructionism and lived experience are not seen as contradictory. Rather, critical phenomenology is understood as an extension of post-structuralist approaches. My reading of some new disability memoirs has shown that these texts contain multiple descriptions of how normative social orders determine and constrain the protagonist's possibilities for embodiment. For this reason, I have read these autobiographies as important contributions to the debate on the relationship between culture and the body, and have shown that central ideas of currently discussed theoretical approaches of critical phenomenology can already be found in these earlier memoirs. Within disability studies too, the question of the connection between normative orders and embodiment was already discussed in the 1990s. Today, this perspective informs the fields of literary and cultural studies in order to redefine the relationship between body and world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Simon Dickel. Now we will start the part of the debate. So for this part of the event, we have here with us Professor Ana Paula Barbosa-Fohrmann. She is Professor of Legal Theory at the National Law School of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She is also the coordinator of the research group on theory of human rights, the NTDH. We also have Professor Philippe de Almeida, who is Professor of Philosophy of Law at the National Law School of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and Professor Vitor Fônseca. He is Professor of Civil Procedure at the Amazon Institute of Applied Law. Ana will coordinate the debate from now on. So Ana, you can start.
Thank you, Karina. Thank you, Professor Simon, for that great talk. So, Professor Ana Paula, would you like to start?
Yes. So, Thank you, Simon, for your rich and interesting talk. Thank you a lot. Your talk makes me turn again to your book, Embodying Difference, Critical Phenomenology and Narratives of Disability, Race, and Sexuality. In this writing, as I could apprehend from it, you bring an interdisciplinary approach. You move between phenomenological philosophy, post-structuralism, literature, and cultural studies to flesh out your arguments. More specifically, you combine the philosophical perspective based on Merleau-Ponty's A Phenomenology of Perception, 1945, with Foucault's post-structuralism and insights from critical race, gender, and disability studies. With that in mind, I ask you 3 questions. You can choose one of these questions, or you can perhaps try to answer the 3 of them. The first one is, you argue in favor of rescuing the body's experience to overcome the clash over disability models. Could you explore how this overcoming would happen? This is the first question. I will do my questions in a block, so you can choose one of them, or you can choose how you're going to respond them. The second one is, does your view on phenomenology pave the way for a phenomenological model of disability? And the third one is a comment, and then I will do a question. The third one is, the body is the object of reflection by social constructivism, specifically by authors of social anthropology and psychology, as well as by historians. They understand, based, for example, on Foucault's philosophy, that the body and its experience are just social constructs. I consider this view to be quite radical, since the experience of the body for itself, as Dan Zahavi states, the body for meaningness or mindiness, or of the first person bodily experience, as I understand it, and as you put in your own book, is not taken into account, or if considered, it is understood as resulting from group, collective, cultural experiences. They also mistakenly understand that the first person experience of the body is only linked to the roots of enlightenment, of liberalism, which in their view understands the body in an individualistic or atomized way. Undoubtedly, there is a discursive, political, ideological, culturally colonial identitarian bias in this understanding of the perceptive experience of one's own body. Would there be, in your mind, in your view, examples grounded in the phenomenology of the body that contradict that radical view of social constructivism?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that was quite a lot. Thank
yes, you can choose one of them, please.
Thank you for the 3 questions. I'll start with the first question about the social model and the medical model of disability, and how critical phenomenology might be a way to overcome this division, and how this could be done, if I understood it correctly.
Yes.
So to clarify once again, the medical model of disability is focused on the body and sees limitations on an individual level. A person has an impairment, and this is the way the medical model frames the disability. And in the medical model, one sees the limitation in the built environment, for example, or also in ableist norms. If a person in a wheelchair approaches a flight of stairs and cannot go up, it is not because of the limitation of the body that this person cannot enter the building, but it is because the environment is built in a way that this person is excluded. So the two terms that match the medical and the social model are impairment for the medical model and disability for the social model. And it is often said that it is similar within gender studies. Impairment relates to sex and disability relates to gender. So the sex-gender division is also the division between impairment and disability, so to speak, just to understand it better. And I think that in my talk, I quoted Hughes and Patterson, who very early on in 1997 have already tried to bridge this gap and have made very clear that to conceptualize these spheres as separate spheres is not really working, because our understandings of bodies are, of course, also informed by cultural beliefs about bodies. And it is a similar move that, for example, Judith Butler made when she argued that sex too is a social construction. And they would argue that impairment too is a social construction. Our ideas about the impaired bodies are also cultural ideas. And then on the other hand, they would also argue that ideas about the social construction of bodies within post-structuralism should also include ways or questions about how normative orders affect individuals and how individuals can live their lives. So they argue that the separation doesn't really work. And I would agree with them. I also think that, and your question would be, how can this become common knowledge, or how can there be a paradigm to
Yes.
Okay.
In this sense, the question is, there is this clash between the medical model and the social model of disability, and how can this phenomenological view on disability can dialogue with these two models, or put these two models in dialogue. Because it seems to me that the social model has a very particular point of view of the body as the experience of the body as socially constructed, as power constructed, as culturally constructed. So it does not give too much attention to the self-experience of the body. That's what I mean.
So I think the reason why the idea of social constructionism was criticized within the field of disability studies earlier than, for example, gender studies or these other disciplines, you name them, is because it does not really, there's really no way to address, for example, chronic pain or something that is felt on a bodily level.
Yes, perfect.
And I think this is the reason why why this discussion happened earlier within disability studies compared to gender studies, for example. And I mean,
for example, congenital disabilities. Someone is born with this congenital disability. It's not socially constructed. It's someone has an own experience from the beginning on of her or his life of this disability. It was not influenced by the society or by oppressive powers or dominant powers or these dichotomies that we see in social constructivism, post-structuralism, and so on.
And I think for these reasons, there are a number of texts that try to mediate between the two models. And of course, these two models are for us to understand better how disability was conceptualized. And of course, the social model was, of course, very important for the disability rights movement to understand that it is not our individual situation with which we must cope on an individual level, but there are social structures that exclude us from participating in society. And so the advent of the social model in the early 1980s was really fueling the disability rights movement and really helped them to form and become effective. But of course, the intervention then by Hughes and Patterson said, okay, but this can explain only so much, and there is something going on at a physical level, something that is felt, that, for example, pain, and we need to be able to address that too. And but yeah, and I think they have done it, and I think especially in this book that I talked about, Exile and Pride, Eli Clare talks very well about how these two spheres cannot be separated, and how, for example, the hurtful words that he was addressed with when he was growing up, how these affected him on a visceral level, on a bodily level, and how culture and the body always intersect in ways that cannot be neatly separated, as the model would suggest.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then the second question you asked for, if there is a phenomenological model of disability, I'm not so sure. I think that of course this intervention by Hughes and Patterson, but also others, Margaret Childrick and others who write about these texts, they have, of course, they are informed by phenomenology, and but no one has suggested this as a term or as an approach. Maybe someone could do it, but I don't see that this is something that is discussed as a term at the moment.
Yeah, there is a text of Martini of 2014 or 13, and he discusses this possibility of having a model of a phenomenological model. But he does not give too much can I say basis to support his argument. But I understand in my own research, I understand that it could be, we could perhaps think about this in the sense that if we agree that phenomenology has a methodology, that we can follow this methodology based on qualitative research, based on description, based on interpretation. So based on these three pillars of phenomenology, so we can think about of building a kind, I don't know, a model of a phenomenological model. So I think we have perhaps a kind of a primary basis to think about this. This is what I think, yeah.
So I think so. I mean, it might work, but maybe the way to address disability should come out of the disability rights movement and not out of the academy. I don't know. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, so we can. Yes, I understand what you mean, and I understand that if we give the voice, this is a very important thing. Give the voice to the person with disability, to speak in the first person about his or her experience of disability. We can construct perhaps a model of a phenomenological model of disability. That's the point. So, yeah. And so we don't need necessarily to have a kind of an intervention of the social model or activists of the social model to think about this. We should perhaps give these this voice, this is something that I really support, to give the voice to the person with disability and the voice to other minorities too, as you do in your text, based, grounded in literary texts. And yes, you do this. I did that in my second PhD in philosophy. So I think this is very important. And through this, we can perhaps construct a kind of a model of, it's just an idea, a kind of a model of a phenological model of disability. So, yeah.
So I don't know how well received phenomenology is within. I mean, I was a student of philosophy when I studied philosophy, and at the time, phenomenology was not a very big thing, at least at the place where I studied. And I wonder whether a phenomenological model of disability would have much success, because phenomenology is not widely discussed at the moment. At least I feel it. I think it's...
Yes, you're right. I will give also place ground to my colleagues to make their question, and we can talk afterwards or in emails. I can perhaps go to your university and talk more about this. Yes, you're right. We are nowadays a minority. We phenomenologists are a minority, and but I feel that in the last 10 years, as you put quite well in your book, phenomenology has been rescued by some researchers and theoreticians that think about this, and how can we complement the social model of disability with phenomenological points of view and justifications, fundaments, and I think it's very important. So
and I think this can also be done. I mean, in the other chapters that don't focus on disability, for example, the writers also explain how the way that people look at them for example, if there's a white gaze on the black body, as in the case of the memoir that I analyzed, that this also affects the bodily level of a person. But the white gaze and racism, I mean, these are of course also cultural things, but then they are experienced on a bodily level. And so, of course, culture and this bodily levels have to be negotiated in order to get a full picture to address, for example, racism or to address social inequalities. I'm with you, of course, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not in a position to give it a name or to establish a name, or I think this will happen in some other ways. I don't know.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So before we move on to our next debater, there's a question from the audience. If you wouldn't mind answering, Professor Zeman. So Sheila Pires is asking, can congenital or acquired physical limitations be compared in any degree to race or gender limitations?
So I think what one can compare are the discussions about categories of difference. So I would say that disability, gender, race, these are categories of difference that are used in a society and that are also theorized about. And what I think one can do is to have a look at different theories and see how do these theories address these topics. And in this respect, they can, of course, be compared, because I think there are many parallels, for example, between the fields of gender studies, critical race theory, and disability studies, in terms of which writers have been read in these fields and how, for example, has the work of Michel Foucault influenced ideas to think about race, to think about gender, to think about disabilities. I don't think that I'm in a position to say one can compare the situation of a person with cerebral palsy with I don't know. I mean, this is not what I'm interested in to compare the situation that real persons are in, because I'm a literary scholar and I'm working with texts, and text is what I'm working with, and I think from this perspective I can make comparisons or draw parallels and see how one of these fields maybe informs the other. But the way the question is framed, I wouldn't want to be in a position to say we can compare disability with race, because I hope I have explained it, what I mean. Yeah?
Thank you, Professor Dickel. Thank you, Professor Ana Paula, also for your interventions. And so now we can move on to Professor Philippe, if you're okay with making your considerations.
Thank you, Ana. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Núcleo de Teoria dos Direitos Humanos da UFRJ for the event. I would like to thank Professor Ana Paula for the invitation. I would also like to thank Professor Simon for the opportunity to read Embodying Difference. In recent years, I have developed my research under the inspiration of critical legal studies, and in particular, critical race theory. One of the central themes of my work has been the body as a field of political confrontations. But it was only after reading Embodying Difference that I realized that the phenomenology of perception based on Merleau-Ponty can be an important tool to discuss ableism, racism, and homophobia. When discussing the white gaze, critical race theory is often concerned with the representation of Black bodies, but not with the corporeal being in the world. A critical phenomenology can help us to think about the materiality of the body and the way in which the categories of difference are constructed. Based on these considerations, I have two questions. The first question is, in the second part of the third chapter of the Embodying Difference, Professor Simon discusses some films that problematize Western oculocentrism, especially when addressing the relationship between blind people and Black people. The purpose of these films is to demonstrate how the stigma imposed on Black people is associated with the centrality that vision has in Western culture. However, Professor Simon is also critical of the ideology of colorblindness. Indeed, one of the main themes debated by critical race theory is the myth of legal colorblindness. A person can be indifferent to racial categorizations and yet benefit from a racist social structure. So I would like Professor Simon talk a little more about this. And the second question is, one of the most interesting developments of critical race theory is disability critical race theory. The purpose of this movement is to debate the intersection between racism and ableism. This crit has shown that racism is not experienced in the same way by people with and without disabilities. And ableism is not experienced in the same way by white and non-white people. The disabled Black body is subject to a specific set of violence and discrimination, which interfere in the way the individual perceives the world and himself. What contribution could critical phenomenology make to this debate?
Okay, that also was a lot, like 2 questions at the same time. So with the first question, you would like me to address the relationship between ocular centrism and color blindness? Is that it? Okay. Let me just have a brief look in the chapter that you referred to, which film I addressed there. It's probably, I forgot the title of the film that I'm writing about. Let me see. Okay. I can't find it this fast, but so ocular centrism means the fact that within Western philosophical tradition, the primacy is on the sense of seeing. So one has that also in philosophical texts where sight is like for example the expression I see, I understand. That this is like an expression of ocular centrism. I don't really know what your question is, actually. I think this is my problem.
Derek Bell, for example, discussed that the color blindness is not a problem there are a strict
I can't understand.
Between.
I think you're breaking up, Professor. Tá cortando.
Can you hear me? My connection is.
Yeah.
Derek Bell discussed that exists a link between the myth of colorblindness, a society that ignores the difference of colors between the subjects, and the racist structures of Western, and that now we live in a racist society without racists.
Okay.
The individuals specifically don't recognize race as a factor of discrimination, but we live in a society racist yet. We live in a society in which Black people is situated in vulnerable positions, and this invisibilization of the theme of the Blackness is a factor that stimulates that the racism.
Yeah, so I think George Jancy, for example, addresses this quite good, because so he is critical of this idea that we live in a post-race society. I mean, this idea of being post-race is obviously not true if you have a look at all the violence done against people of color, and so his book Black Bodies, White Gazes, for example, in this book he talks also against the ideology of colorblindness. So the idea, if I don't see race, then it doesn't exist, and if we all just don't talk about it, racism will somehow magically go away. And I think the other way is true. I think one has to address race, and one has to address differences in order to be able to understand them and to politically act against them. And the text and the films that I address in my book, there's one German film that I talk about. It's called Auf den zweiten Blick, at second glance. And there you have a variety of blind characters who live in Berlin. And there are also an unusual number of Black actors in the film. But race is never mentioned in the film. And I think blindness is used in a way to introduce the idea of color blindness. But it's not as simple as I now make it. It's not an unintelligent film. I think it is an intelligent film, but still this parallel discourse of blackness and blindness that the film suggests, I think it doesn't really work out in the end. So I think blackness should have been addressed in the film. And I mean, also, blind people also know if a person is Black or not. It's just they don't see the skin color, but they have different senses and they understand it in different ways. And they have a concept of race, of course, growing up in the society. So the film is a little bit a simplified idea of how society could be changed by maybe not addressing or maybe ignoring the category of race. But I think Jansi, for example, makes it very clear that this is not the way, and that the ocular sense and seeing have to be addressed also within phenomenological discussions. I don't know if does that answer your question a little bit?
Perfect.
Okay. And but now I forgot a little bit the gist of the second question. Maybe you could
Can I read the second question again?
Yeah. Sorry. Maybe I'm just a person, one question after the other.
Yes. One of the most interesting developments of critical race theory is disability critical race theory. Is a movement conducted by authors like Subinyanama, etc. The purpose of this movement is to debate the intersection between racism and ableism. Mm-hmm. This critique has shown that racism is not experienced in the same way by people with and without disabilities, and ableism is not experienced in the same way by white and non-white people. The disabled Black body is subject to a specific set of violence and discrimination, which interfere in the way the individual perceives the world and himself. What contribution could critical phenomenology make to this debate?
Could you explain it? White
I am interested in the intersection between ableism and racism, and the manner of the disabled Black people experienced the words because in your work you analyze in different chapters the experience of Blackness and the experience of ableism. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of papers now preoccupied with the question of the relation, the relationship of Blackness and ableism, and the specificity of the violence against the disabled black body, or the disabled non-white body.
So in my talk today, there was one text that I addressed, The Magic Wand by Manning, who was a black and blind poet and also performer. And in his text, it becomes clear that these discourses, like ableist discourses and racist discourses, they somehow built on the assumption that blackness and blindness are somehow mutually exclusive, that there is no room for a black and blind subject. And with his text, he intervened into this idea of them being mutually exclusive, and also in a way showing the different types of stereotypes he encounters as a black and blind person, depending on the situation, whether the people who see him understand that he is blind or whether they think he is sighted. And if they think he's sighted, they have completely different assumptions about him as a black person based on racist stereotypes than when they assume that he is blind. And then the stereotypes and also the way he's treated change. Other than that, I read a book by Christopher Bell, who I think also writes about the interconnection of blackness and blindness. But I think we would maybe need an example or something more concrete to go into this more deeply. I think I cannot say anything else about it.
In Brazil, we have a great writer and novelist named Lima Barreto. He was a black man and alcoholic. And in some of the texts of Lima Barreto, he wrote about the experience of being a black man with mental disabilities, and talked that the systematic incarcerations that he was subjected in his life is not only because he is an alcoholic, but because he's a black alcoholic. And this has a substantial difference. Subina Nama, in a recent book named The Pedagogy of Pathologization, defends that black children's are more diagnosed with mental disturbs than white children for the same conduct. So there is a pathologization of blackness in a racist society, and this has a huge impact of the form of a black individual with disabilities experienced his own body.
Yeah,
my question is in this direction.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. Yeah, what?
Okay, so I'm sorry, would you like to continue, Professor Dickel? I thought you were, no?
No, it's all right.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Philippe, for your reflections and your questions. I would like now, to give the floor to Professor Vitor Fônseca. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana. I'd like to congratulate first Professor Dickel for the excellent speech. I would like also to thank Professor Ana Paula for kindly invite me for this roundtable. I'll have two questions, but each question at a time, Professor.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
So the first one is about a part of your book. I would like to highlight your book's connection between invisible disability and coming out of the closet. You say that deafness and autism, for example, are disabilities that generate stigma, especially for the person comes out of the closet. They can be considered as invisible disabilities. I have an example. Here in Brazil, we have a book, Crônicas da Surdez, Chronicles of Deafness. The author, Paula Pfeiffer, she's deaf. She says that she and some deaf people are ashamed to stand in legal priority lines at supermarkets or at banks. As a deaf woman, she has the right, as a person with disabilities, to keep in a legal priority line. But she says, and she explains that she's ashamed. So to stay keep in the line so that persons don't think she's cheating or pretending she has some disability. So can you elaborate, can you explain more this connection between the gay closet, the coming out of the closet for gay persons and people with disabilities, please?
So what you say reminds me of a friend of mine who did research about wheelchair use. And she interviewed friends of hers who use wheelchairs only sometimes. So they don't need wheelchairs all the time, but sometimes they use them. And so when bystanders see them getting out of the wheelchair to walk, they are very often, they meet like aggressive reactions because people think they are cheating and they think they are trying to get some, I don't know, some benefits that they don't deserve. And that this is maybe something similar than to what you say. With deafness, I think it's also the case that people who are slowly lose the ability of hearing, that it is only very late that they go to a doctor and that they get hearing aids, and that most of the times they could have done it much earlier, and that it's also this stigma and the shame involved in that, in not wanting to be seen with hearing aids, for example. And of course, this the reason for this is, of course, the stigma related to disability, and that is very powerful in our societies, probably. And I write about these parallel discourses of coming out as a gay man and coming out as blind in my book, basically because Thomas G. Kauser, in his book about disability memoirs, makes a very strong point in arguing that Stephen Kusisto, in this book, Planet of the Blind, that the way when he starts to use the white cane and becomes blind for everyone to see, and everyone understands that he is not sighted, that this follows the conventions of the coming out narrative that you can find in novels by gay men, for example, or autobiographies. And I agreed partly to that, but I also think that it's not the same. It's not the same. I think in some points I also contradicted G. Thomas Kauser's reading of Stephen Kusisto. But I think it is also in the text that Kusisto himself frames it this way. So he is invisibly blind before, then he has the white cane. He is seen as blind and disabled, and it is, of course, some kind of coming out. And I think it is fair to frame it in that in these terms, because it is such a dominant cultural narrative that one can understand it in these terms. So
Thank you. And the second question is about something you say in your book, and I would like to hear you about something further. I would like to discuss what you call open violence. In your book, you defend that, I quote, open hostility and violence against persons with visible identities, as in the case of racism, have severe effects on how one can inhabit one's body. You also recall that stigmatized persons often point out bodily sensations when they experience discrimination. Their heart beats faster, their hands get sweaty, and the tonality of their voices changes. I work with civil justice and work with civil procedure. This is my research area. And so this reminds me of some arguments used by judges and jurors in trials based on questionable methods about body language to diminish or to discredit or delegitimize the testimony of witnesses and victims of some crimes. Maybe the body language doesn't mean the witness is necessarily lying. There are studies and papers that realized and concluded that testimonies of persons with intellectual disabilities are considered by judges and jurors less true than others. Because persons with intellectual disabilities, they speak slowly, they repeat words, and they eventually forget things, and they make stops when they are in their narrative. So how the person with disability tells a story matters for jurors and judges. So do you think this open violence can also conduct also to a secret violence or an implicit discrimination by judges and jurors and create some stereotypes that are very hard to extinguish, or very hard to break them, according to these stigmatized persons?
Yeah, I mean, you probably have much more expertise on this because I mean, the example that you give is from your own practice, so to speak. And of course, one way maybe to circumvent it could be to record what they say and then translate it into a written document, and then without seeing the person, just read the testimony. And maybe come to a more unbiased conclusion about it. Maybe that just an idea. Maybe that could be a way to circumvent it. But I'm pretty sure that cultural stereotypes about mental health, for example, and the way that people talk have a strong effect on how much is believed of what they say. And if what they say is believed to be true or not. I think there's a direct connection between the way one talks and the way it is received by others. But of course, in a justice system, this should never be the case. I mean, but yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I'd like to thank you so much, everyone who participated today. I'm sure we learned a lot with all of you, Professors Simon Dickel, Vitor Fônseca, Philippe de Almeida, and Ana Paula. Professor Ana Paula would like to say anything else to finish?
In our group, and we going to have another one this year, and so I hope that this idea will succeed in the next years. I'm just going to tell Professor Simon that we have in Portuguese 5 or 6 roundtables on disabilities and phenomenology. So international roundtables on this theme is something that I wanted to do, and I conceived as an idea for a year ago, and you are the first one we have here, and I thank you a lot for your speech and talk and your time you spend with us, and my colleagues' interventions, and my dear colleagues' interventions, Philippe and Vitor. I also like to thank my two students, my PhD student Ana Paula Barbosa-Fohrmann and my LLM student Karina Guiar, who were here today and moderate this panel. And I hope we have another one this year, and I suppose so, in the second semester. And we are going to announce when and how and when it will be. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be the first guest on this roundtable, and also thank you for your thoughtful questions. And I'm really humbled that you actually read my book, and
yes,
I'm happy about that.
It's a wonderful book, and I made Ana and Ana, you can talk about this.
Yeah, I told Professor Dickel before we entered here, but I didn't mention that you also did a review on his book. He was wondering if we could send it to him afterwards, if when it gets published, hopefully.
Yes, of course, you can do this. And I hope we can talk afterwards and keep on talking. It is a pleasure to have you here, and also we want to perhaps build some partnerships in the field of international cooperation that link our universities. It will be a pleasure for us to keep on constructing our academic relationship. Thank
great.
you.
Let's keep in touch.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, wonderful.
Okay. So thank you again. That's the end of the event. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.